I usually use standing up here as a platform to say whatever I want, as you know. My first comment is Bill Henderson retires, and the first week he doesn't come anymore. My second comment is whoever's watching over the world, you know I was going to do this.
You didn't have to tell me.
Yeah, it's doing a lousy job right now. I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I'm a big Laker fan, and I just absolutely crushed this. I'm sure everybody in the world is. I cannot get my head around this, or the rest of the crap that's going on in the world right now either, for that matter. My only, no, I actually mean it. It's made me very depressed. My only serious comment is for the upcoming allergy meeting, if anybody who's listening, either in the room or outside the room, who wants to go to the foundation dinner, the fundraiser dinner that's a Saturday, would like to put together 2 tables for Northwest Asthma University or anybody else who's really affiliated with our more extended group. So write me an email if you're going to attend that event and you want to sit at the table with friends and colleagues. I'd like, there are 10 at a table and about maybe at 15 now, so we have room for maybe 5 more people.
Thank you, sir.
All right, so with those comments aside, David's going to talk to us today about food allergy prevention, peanut, and beyond. Thanks for coming over.
Is there a word of the day, Lynn?
There
It
is.
should be on the first slide, I think.
I was told to put it on the last slide.
Yeah.
It's food.
It's just
food.
food.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for a chance to talk about this topic. I'm recovering from a little cold, so I will probably not sound super attractive at all times today. Forgive me for that. Anyway, so we'll talk about food allergy prevention, as Lynn said. These are my disclosures for today. My objectives will be to run through a very brief introduction of food allergy. We'll talk about risk factors associated with food allergy, and then we'll dive into some prevention strategies that are being investigated, most notably oral tolerance induction. It's gotten a lot of attention over the last 5 years. Some points about screening using some of the criteria that have been proposed in some of these studies, and then some other directions, other strategies for prevention, and we'll talk about some things on the horizon in the future. So with food allergy, these are not new numbers to all of us in the room here. 6 to 8% of children and 3 to 4% of adults are affected by food allergies. Currently, what we recommend is avoid the allergen and be ready for trouble with rescue meds and in case there's a reaction. Currently, there's a lack of definitive treatments, and with the high prevalence of food allergy, that's led to an increase in research into identifying risk factors, both genetic and environmental, and also looking into effective prevention strategies. And in the thinking here, the hope here is that the old adage that an ounce of prevention is possibly worth a pound of cure. So risk factors, genetics, not a foreign concept to us. In children with neither parent with allergies, we're seeing up to a 15% risk of developing some type of atopic condition. If there is one parent, that risk effectively doubles to between 20 and 40%. And if you've got both parents, that again possibly doubles up to a 60 to 80% chance of some type of atopic issue developing in your child.
So this is some form of atopic,
some form
not specific to food allergy.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Other factors here with food allergies, specifically race. Not a ton of data, but there is some, and it conflicts. There is some data that perhaps black people might be more prone to developing certain food allergies, like shellfish allergy. But again, it's really conflicting. In gender, Again, not a ton of data, but this one was fairly notable in the health nuts cohort out of Australia. They confirmed that there is a male predominance of food allergies, particularly when you're dealing with children who have multiple food allergies, and peanut and or egg are one of those. Maternal diet, lots of questions and attention, but to date, no hard convincing evidence that restriction of any kind or manipulation of any kind will be beneficial for pregnancy or while nursing. The microbiome is getting a lot of attention as well in terms of aberrations leading to risk. And one of the main issues that plagues us right now in terms of the microbiome is really a definition or a lack thereof of really what is normal. There isn't a clear consensus or a clear definition of what a normal or healthy gut is. Does that mean that there's a diverse population of species, or is there a specific organism or set of organisms, or is it a bit of both? As you can imagine, this is going to be important to establish before we really know how to dive into this with meaningful research.
Can you go back a slide? As far as maternal diet,
Yeah.
I mean, for a long time, it was believed that that was important. You know, with guidelines that mothers should or shouldn't eat if they were atopic. That's basically all been thrown out.
Yeah, that has been thrown out, and that actually, I believe that dates back to the 2008 time period when some of the guidelines changed about, restricting foods out of babies' diets. This was also, this verbiage was also thrown into those guidelines as well. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but there was an update on this in a recent report from the AAP. So the data we have currently on microbiome-related issues, there was some fairly early data that C-section delivery might be shown to delay gut microbiome development and therefore increase the sensitization to food allergens. But then some later studies with oral food challenge proven food allergy outcomes showed some mixed results when you compare C-section versus vaginal delivery. So that remains to be seen. In the health nuts cohort out of Australia, they made an observation that the presence of a dog in the home can be inversely associated with clinical egg allergy at a year of age. There's mixed data on antibiotic exposure, both prenatally and postnatally. And then in terms of comparing breastfeeding versus formula feeding and its impact on the microbiome, that also remains to be seen as well. A couple of other miscellaneous risk factors here. Vitamin D deficiency, there is at present day some mixed results on this, as you probably all know, and there is a bit of a renewed effort to look into this a bit more, and I'll get into that later. Antioxidant-rich fresh fruits and vegetables, there's some limited data showing a decreased prevalence of food allergy if that's prominent in the diet of infants. And then there is also some data showing that obesity might be linked to at least increased sensitization to foods as well. And of course, this has been largely sort of accepted since for really about 10 or 12 years now, the dual allergen exposure hypothesis as one of the primary drivers of food allergy development. This refers to the balance of exposures during the first year of life can prime the immune system either towards allergy or tolerance, and that depends on whether the initial exposure to a food is through the skin or the gut, respectively. And so on the skin exposure side, referred to as transcutaneous sensitization, peanut is one of the most significant models we have of this. So the contact with peanut through regular environmental exposures, especially in children who have eczema, can serve as a mechanism of sensitizing children. And a few studies here from 2013, this group showed that eczema severity can amplify the risk of peanut sensitization, and that can come from peanut exposure in household dust. And then the same group also commented and observed that there's a similar increase in risk of peanut allergy if there is confirmed filaggrin loss of function mutations, and also subsequently exposed to high levels of peanut in household dust. And there are also studies from a ways back that show that egg, milk, and fish have also been detected in household dust. So there's a possibility that other foods can be, or babies can become primed to these food allergens in similar fashion as with peanut. On the opposite end of the spectrum, oral exposure or oral tolerance induction. The current view now of late is that tolerance really does come from oral exposure early in life, and that there is a window of opportunity where that is optimally attained. The data and observations that got us to this conclusion, we know from many years that elimination diets or restricting diets until later in childhood were completely ineffective at preventing food allergies. There were data in mice studies showing that oral exposures could induce tolerance. And then, of course, in the last 5 years, the randomized controlled trials and the meta-analyses that have shown that infants exposed to at least peanut early on can have a less chance of becoming allergic.
Dave,
Yes?
how does peanut get into your house? Is it just from peanuts in the house, or is
Yeah,
it?
it's just other family members who, it's just having it in the house and other family members eating it in the home and just incidental spread.
Peanut's easier to understand, because
Eggs and milk.
eggs and milk and fish, it's hard to see how they get aerosolized in a home.
Well, I mean, it's just in the,
Okay.
well, it's just on surfaces too. I mean, if you come into my household with my kids, there's egg and milk everywhere. It's great.
But no
It's not
peanut?
necessarily aerosolized, only aerosolized, and it's on surfaces as well. Yeah.
Well, you may come back to this, but since the LEAP study and the LEAP-ON study and all of that,
Yeah.
I'm curious, just community-wide, I don't do children, I don't see a lot of food allergy, but how good is the uptake of all of that data in our, not only our colleagues ourselves, but in general pediatrics? I know NAC made a big effort to educate the pediatric referring doctors. We don't talk about this much anymore, and I just don't know if, you know, the brilliant work that was done and then it basically fell by the wayside. You see
Yeah.
being done, you know, why, you know, people taking this data and making good use of it.
So practicing pediatrics for 3 years, it's known and it's definitely out there even amongst, I was a pediatrician and even amongst family medicine physicians too. It's just now well established that
So you could actually see mothers go out and buy Bamba or equivalent and.
No, but there's a mindfulness of that it's no longer, I need to completely avoid these foods.
So there's limited data on it, but the group out of Colorado Children's, Dave Fleischer and Matt Greenot, they did a bunch of survey data on this, and in the initial couple of years after the LEAP study came out, the awareness and implementation in the pediatric community was terrible. It was like well under 50%. And there was just a recent article just published earlier this month, I think in JACI in Practice, that commented that those numbers have improved over the last few years. I mean, I think we can think of many examples in which a landmark study doesn't always translate to change in practice immediately.
Right.
It can take time for things to adjust. And I'm going to get into this later, but our guidelines are confusing. And it's not clear what the role of the pediatrician is or what the allergist is, what the role of the allergist is. And so there's there needs to be work on that as well, and I think that will probably lead to a significant increase in adaptation of these current lines of thinking. And since you bring it up, and they also looked at how aware are parents about this, and those numbers are even worse, and maybe that's partly the pediatrician or the allergist, or just parents are probably going to be slower to adapt this than even pediatricians will be, and it's really on us as a medical community. But there's a lot of actually uncertainty, confusion, and even fear about it, because it's such a radical shift.
Just curious, since the work was done in the UK, any data, have they, with socialized medicine and different healthcare system, are they much better at it? Do you have any idea?
Well, they may. I'm gonna talk a little bit about that, 'cause I'm gonna kind of talk about comparisons between different countries, and I think it might shed some light on that point there. Anyway, so speaking of these topics, so the question really then is, how do we induce oral tolerance? And that'll take us to our next part here. The LEAP study, a quick review. This study looked at 4 to 11 months of age infants with moderate to severe eczema and/or egg allergy. There were 640 infants randomized. They were all skin tested. Anybody with a 5 millimeter wheal or greater were excluded. Those under that, there were 2 groups, non-sensitized and sensitized but not allergic. The non-sensitized groups were really trying to answer questions about primary prevention or preventing allergy in those who don't have IgE. And then the sensitized non-allergic group is looking at secondary prevention, which is interrupting or stopping food allergies in sensitized individuals. So these 2 groups were stratified to either consume 2 grams of peanut protein 3 times per week for 60 months, or they were advised to avoid. And as you know, the non-sensitized or the non-allergic state was confirmed by a double-blind challenge, and then these kids were challenged at 60 months with peanut to determine status. Results in the primary prevention group. Is there a?
There is a pointer there.
Well, that's fine. I'll make do. So the primary prevention group in the left, that was the skin test negative cohort. You see that on the bottom there, there's a 86% relative risk reduction, statistically significant findings. So a big difference in the early introduction group. And in the skin test positive cohort, or the secondary prevention group, you see also a statistically significant risk reduction of 70% in the consumption group compared to the avoidance group. And when you take both cohorts combined, again, significant 81% overall risk reduction. So this was obviously a very positive trial. So the conclusions were that this intervention showed early introduction and regular consumption of peanut resulted in a significant reduction in allergy at 60 months of age. It demonstrated that both primary and secondary prevention is possible using this method. And there are plans with the study authors to look at this same cohort when they turn 12 to then also determine if they're still allergic or not. There were secondary analyses that were possible with the LEAP data because the data sets were required to be public. I highlight this set of observations from Greenhot and Fleischer in Colorado. They suggested or concluded that wheal size on a skin test mattered only if you delayed introduction, but not necessarily in that infant stage. They also concluded that the severity of eczema didn't matter unless you delayed introduction. So again, not necessarily in that first year of life. And they also concluded that the 4 to 6 month age window is possibly too restrictive, and there may be a larger age window of safe introduction than is being let on. They also concluded, or they also stated that this is correct, that none of the risk factors that were used, like severe eczema or egg allergy, were tested rigorously before the study began. These were all assumptions made based on what available data there was in the literature. And so they kind of turn a few things upside down here and make some big statements, and obviously that can affect how guidelines are written and implemented if it's considered. The Leap On study was a study to look at the persistence of oral tolerance induction. It's really the only study of its kind. 556 participants from the Leap study were enrolled. Everybody in the study was advised to avoid peanut for the next 12 months. So at 72 months or 6 years of age, the rate of peanut allergy in the avoidance group, 18.6% versus 4.8% in the consumption group. There were only 3 new cases of peanut allergy in each group. That was considered basically no significant change, which leads to the conclusion that non-allergic status of children who had been consuming peanut remained stable over that 12 months of avoidance. So the oral tolerance does seem to last.
So 18.6 wasn't considered different than 4.8?
No, I'm sorry, 18.6% was considered no different than 17.2% in the LEAP study.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So comparing the data from the LEAP study, not comparing the two cohorts to each other, yeah.
Did they ever look at blood sensitization studies instead of skin tests? Because I remember being told a long time ago, probably before you were born, that skin testing below 6 or 8 months of age was not that accurate. And now all of a sudden we're making all this data based on a 4-month-old skin test and there's no RAS score. So did they ever look at that data?
They didn't use that as criteria, at least for this study.
Did they have that?
Yeah, I think it would.
Seriously.
They looked at IgE and IgG4. I apologize, I don't have the exact information at the tip of my tongue right now.
But obviously it wasn't
a
important that
primary.
it would publish it.
Correct. Yeah, it was not. It was definitely not a primary endpoint in this.
What did they do with all the kids who had greater than a 5 millimeter? Did they just exclude them, or did they follow them? Or
Go back to your allergist.
What-
Yeah, they just. I don't think they followed them. They just said you can't be part of the study. And so now moving on to egg, I have basically sorry about the small print there, but I have every trial here that's been conducted for early introduction of egg in this table here. I think it's going to be readable on the PDF. You have it on your computers there, but I'm not going to go through every single study, but I do want to point out a few trends in the studies that we have available. Number one, in terms of the, so you have the study names on the left here, and then the population, 2 out of these 5 studies looked at high-risk infants, 2 out of 5 studies looked at intermediate-risk infants, and 1 at the bottom looked at general population. In terms of the intervention that was used, all of these studies looked at introducing egg in some form or another, either 3 times a week or daily, starting around 4 to 8 months of age. 3 out of the 5 studies used raw egg, 2 out of 5 studies used heated egg, and the amount that was given was somewhere between 350 milligrams to 7.5 grams per week. And then the primary outcomes of these studies, 3 out of the 5 studies used oral food challenges to determine egg allergy. 2 out of 5 used sensitization, but not necessarily challenges. So the point in bringing all this up is that it's all these designs are kind of all over the place. They're heterogeneous. They're not consistent. So you can take that as you will in terms of making conclusions. But having said all that, these 4 studies over on the far right show that there is a positive effect or a reduction in risk ratio with early introduction of egg. The only study that did not show that was the one on the bottom, the HEAP study, and that was an insignificant outcome in that study.
What does raw egg mean?
So uncooked egg that's prepared in a powder, so you can mix it in to whatever vehicle you
Egg
want.
white, what you're talking about.
Some of these were actually whole egg. Actually, all the raw egg was whole egg, so it included yolk as well. And then the heated, it would be some kind of I'm not actually exactly sure to what form they got into, but they heated it and then they would turn it into a powder as well.
What accounts for the huge variability in that bottom study?
Not sure. Not sure. It could be
Outliers of some kind?
There could be outliers. I mean, it was a general population study as opposed to the other ones, which were intermediate or high risk. It could be about the amount that they were given or the frequency that they were given, which is, it stands out because most of the other studies here looked at daily exposure as opposed to 3 times a week in that bottom study there. Yeah, not entirely clear.
I look at the range there, 0.2 to 24, it's just all over the map.
It's all over the map, yeah. So the observations about egg, there's significant heterogeneity in the trial designs as we talked about. We talked about the HEAP study on the bottom there had no effect on egg white IgE. In the BEAT study, very big difference in skin prick results for egg. The EAT study, I actually haven't gotten to that yet. I'll get to that next. But that showed a difference in early introduction of egg allergy in terms of allergy outcome, only in the per protocol analysis. The Pebbles Trial is the only one that showed a significant decrease in the intention to treat analysis. And a couple of things that were not in the table here. One of the studies, the STAR study, showed that 31% of infants at 4 months of age who were screened and challenged actually already had an allergy to eggs. So it seems like with egg allergy, it's possible that that allergy can develop very early, possibly earlier than peanut. Raw egg definitely was associated with more reactions, which I didn't include in the table. And heated egg was definitely associated with fewer reactions. Still could be protective, but and kids didn't seem to like it very much. This is the EAT study. Interesting study, somewhat controversial. General population, this is not high risk. Over 1,300 infants that were breastfeeding were screened. The age of entry was 3 months. The groups were to either introduce these 6 foods, milk, egg, fish, peanut, sesame, and weeds, 2 grams per week, either at 3 months of age or at 6 months of age. If you introduce at 6 months of age, you just exclusively breastfeed until then. So those are the 2 groups. You had to give milk first in the form of yogurt, and you had to give wheat last. And then you were assigned to a random order of the other 4 foods in between. And the primary outcome was to look at food allergy at 1 and 3 years of age. So in the overall analysis here, in the intention to treat analysis, you see that there might be a slightly lower prevalence of food allergy in the early introduction group compared to the standard 6-month group, but not statistically significant. But in the per protocol analysis, you see that there was clearly a difference there, and the finding was statistically significant. And a lot of that had to do with just terrible adherence to the protocol. And I'll get into that in just a second. And when you get more granular, it was specifically peanut and egg that were the 2 foods associated with a positive outcome with early introduction. And you see with peanut on the top, in the intention to treat, of course, not significant, but in the per protocol, absolutely significant there. And then with the egg, a similar finding there, significant in the per protocol analysis.
Can you define intention to treat and per protocol? In other words, how that changed, which patients or which group?
Yeah, so the intention to treat was looking at all comers who were randomized into the study, whether they adhere to the protocol or not. And as I mentioned, there was terrible adherence because of a variety of reasons. I have a full slide on that. I'll show you in a second. But the per protocol analysis was just looking at the people who actually adhered to the protocol. Yeah. A couple of other things that the authors point out, that it can be potentially shaky to make conclusions on per protocol data, but the authors point out that there was no bias that they detected in the data. There was also significant concern about whether this might affect breastfeeding duration and quality, especially in the early introduction group, but there was no such finding. which is very reassuring. And they conclude that with the other 4 foods, milk, wheat, sesame, or fish, they could not find a significant benefit to early introduction. So on adherence, if you looked at the standard 6-month introduction, the adherence was really high, 93%. But in the early introduction group, at 3 months, it was only 32%. The adherence was highest for milk at nearly 83%, and it was lowest for egg at 43%. The proposed reasons for these differences: texture, taste, oral motor development, and ease of preparation of food. Yogurt just coming out of a cup or bowl, whereas with foods like egg, you have to prepare it, and that just can be that one extra step of annoyance and inconvenience for families. And you can imagine these things can, the difference between 3 and 6 months of age, these factors can really play a major role. So taking all that into account, we have a meta-analysis from 2016 out of JAMA that said there's moderate certainty of evidence that introducing peanut between 4 and 11 months of age can reduce the risk of peanut allergy based on Leap and Eat. And they also said in the same analysis that there's also enough data that introducing egg between 4 and 6 months of age can also reduce risk of egg allergy, and that's based on those 6 randomized trials. A couple of food for thought questions, pun intended. How important is this 6 grams? That's actually a looming question out there. If you look at the LEAP study, 92% consumed between 6 and 9 grams of peanut protein per week. In the EAT study, it was much lower. 85% consumed 2 grams, and 62% consumed 3 grams, and they both were able to find significant results. So this would imply that at least somewhere between 2 and 6 grams per week would be acceptable, which may take the pressure off of you guys as you counsel your families, because shoving a million bombas down a kid's throat at 6 months of age is not always easy. But there is consensus, although data needs to be further gathered, that you definitely need grams as opposed to milligrams in a week basis to be able to achieve this tolerance.
How much, remind me again, is 1 peanut?
1 peanut's about 250 to 300 milligrams per, depending on the size.
And how about one of those little Bamba things?
Yeah, you need to get about 4 grams, I believe you need about 35 sticks.
Wow.
And I think there might be a difference with the Trader Joe's version versus the Awesome version, but yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. Some kids can do it.
For a day?
No, the 6 grams per week or 2 grams per week, yeah. And then we talked about what is the importance of the timing. Basically, the LEAP study, there were about 18%, only 18% were younger than 6 months at recruitment, and 20% were younger than 6 months when they introduced peanuts. So a big chunk of these people were past 6 months. And so there may not necessarily be an importance or a stress to get it that early. And the LEAP authors come out right and admit that even though they did their study a certain way, that the optimal timing of introduction has yet to be defined. I wanted to comment on screening just a bit.
Since you said that, if you were a pediatrician or a pediatric allergist and you skin tested a kid who came from a high-risk family or had high risk, and he was 18 months, for example, but he was still skin test small enough, follow this protocol no matter what age?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I would, no matter when you catch them, you want to get it in. But the point is that introducing at 4 months as opposed to say 10 months, right? That there may not be a difference with that. There may be with 18 months. That doesn't mean you don't try. You still got to try. Yeah.
Right.
So screening, just a few words on this. So this is the current guideline we have from NIAID in 2017 after all this data was released. severe eczema, egg allergy, or both, and they really use the word strongly consider an allergy evaluation either with a blood test or skin prick, and an oral food challenge, and then try to get it in as early as 4 to 6 months if you can. Anybody with no eczema or mild to moderate eczema, just feed and don't worry about seeing an allergist. So that's our guideline right now. And there's no comment on any other food besides peanut at this moment. This was an interesting, I think, logical gradient that was proposed by, again, the Colorado group on determining risk of an infant for peanut allergy. Starting at the bottom, a general population infant with no risk factors would be low risk. A sibling with peanut allergy is next, then family history of any atopy, then mild to moderate eczema, other food allergies, namely egg, and then severe eczema would be your highest risk. And there's some data from the Australia group in 2016 that said that with the second to top category, if you have if you have an egg allergy infant without eczema, there's an 11% chance that that kid could have a peanut allergy. But if you combine egg allergy and eczema, there's a 35% chance of being allergic to peanuts. So those two factors do seem to be by and far the most important.
David, I'm curious if like articles like this, which I haven't read, do they talk about like walnut, cashew? I mean, granted, there's not a study, but I know, like personally, I've sort of extrapolated to, doing challenges with those if, small skin test in neonates.
Yeah.
Much like LEAP.
So no, they don't comment on this in this particular
I mean, it's
report,
speculation, obviously. But.
It is, but I'm gonna, I think in a few slides, I'll point out that there's going to be a new set of guidelines and they're going to try to address these other foods that, even the ones that we don't have any data on.
Does the severity of the eczema, other than just severe eczema, is it rated up from just mild eczema to moderate to severe, or is it just severe is the only one that really sets your risk factor apart from the other kinds of eczema? You have them sort of at two different levels.
Yes, I do, and that admittedly, the way that NIAID kind of defines severe eczema is sort of, I don't know how you guys feel, but I find it to be a bit vague and it's very user dependent and subjective, but it can be about body surface area, it can be about certain lesions that just need steroid every day, but it may not be covering your entire body. You could fit any of those into the potential definitions, but I think really I guess if you want, you could do a score out on everybody, but that would be painful. But it kind of is a little bit ill-defined. So I guess another way to look at it is who is not at risk, and therefore who do you not need to necessarily test? Infants with parents who have allergies, infants who have siblings with food allergies, including peanut allergy, infants with any other food allergy except egg, and infants who don't have severe eczema, and anybody else. That's eye-opening because I personally have tested some of these. They're extenuating circumstances, but really, this is kind of where the data leads us. So, is it worth it to screen? That's an important question. The cost of implementing this strategy in the U.S., $654 million from a U.S. society perspective to do this over the next 20 years, all to diagnose 3,208 peanut allergy cases in that time. So is the juice worth the squeeze? I don't know. The cost is significant.
Calculate that number.
I don't know, but it's pretty interesting. I don't have an answer for you. But it was so compelling, I felt like I had to include it. The cost is significant for, nothing against these 3,208 people, but it's a small number of people. And so it really looks to be very expensive. It can result in fewer reactions over time as you diagnose, especially if you use kind of a higher cutoff, or even if you use a higher cutoff like 8 millimeters. But then this can also lead to tremendous overdiagnosis because food allergy testing is awful.
What was
poor specificity.
the number of people that were screened?
Great question. I don't remember off the top of my head. It was a lot.
Yeah.
It was a lot, yeah, but I don't remember the number.
$200,000.
Other considerations here. If you implement these screening guidelines, 87% of high-risk children would unnecessarily delay introduction while they're waiting to see one of us. And there's not a lot of us. I can't get people in next week and do a challenge the week after that. And that's, I think, a reality for a lot of us here. 25% of infants with peanut allergy don't meet the risk criteria for LEAP. So it would miss a lot of people. The Australia group showed in their huge cohort that not a single person, low or high risk, infants who introduced peanut on their own at home had any kind of a life-threatening or dangerous reaction, and that's reassuring in terms of counseling and screening. It might be that it's not just egg either, it might be milk. If you have a milk allergy, do screen for peanut if you want to go that far. But on the flip side, maybe if a parent is so paralyzed with fear of peanut allergy and won't feed it to them unless you test them, I mean, maybe you test them, and that will potentially decrease chance of a diagnosis there.
Back to that expense number, this is maybe a harsh way of looking at it, but how many deaths are there per year from peanut or any of the major food allergies?
Yeah.
So the ultimate thing you're going to correct.
Yeah, so well under 200 deaths per year from food allergy, and most of those that occur are from peanut. So yeah, I mean, it's a small number compared to the number of people who are actually allergic. So your point is?
My point is, you spend an immense amount of money.
$3 million.
Yeah,
It's a John Grisham.
Yeah.
I mean, you may disagree with me. It's hard. I just told you what I thought the value of one life was. Started this morning, but I don't have a point other than just think about it.
Sure. Just to kind of introduce you to the rest of the world and what they're saying, the UK, based on this data, published guidelines in 2018. They state that peanut and egg need not be differentiated from other complementary foods. Should be introduced in age-appropriate form around 6 months of age. Not that far off from where we are. Families of infants with a history of early onset eczema or suspected food allergy of any kind, may wish to seek medical advice, as opposed to what we say, which is strongly considered. So they're kind of maybe a little softer in their verbiage than we are. And then look at Australia. They're totally on the opposite end of the spectrum. All infants should be given allergenic solid foods, including peanut butter, cooked egg, dairy, and wheat in the first year of life. And this includes infants at high risk of allergy without screening. So interesting how different English-speaking countries view the same thing differently. So should we be more like our international friends? Maybe so. Screening may not be cost-effective or necessary for a number of reasons: the limited workforce, imperfect criteria for who to screen, poor specificity of allergy testing, and rare severe symptoms upon first exposure. If you do screen, as a practitioner, as a practice, as a country, we should really embrace the idea of food challenges, simply because allergy testing is oftentimes very unhelpful in predicting clinical allergy. And if you do screen, as Bob Wood would say here, we just need better guidelines on who to screen and how to implement everything. So speaking of which, that is on the minds of some people. There is to come very soon a revised food allergy prevention guideline. It's a joint effort. They're going to define high-risk criteria for infants, hopefully different than what we have now. They're going to have recommendations for all the major food allergies. They're going to talk about dietary diversity, how to implement these guidelines, and then they're also going to present a cost analysis of their own. We'll see if those numbers are similar to the ones that impressed you, Len. Anyway, so other strategies that beyond oral tolerance induction. If we know that eczema is a problem, can we prevent it from happening in the first place, and maybe that will help decrease food allergy. So there's a birth cohort, the ALSPAC birth cohort, published 2003 by LAC. They concluded that in infants that had peanut allergy by 5 years of age, they were much more likely to have had severe eczema in the first 6 months of life. So the current working hypothesis among many researchers is that prompt intensive moisturization from birth would help the evolution and maintenance of an intact skin barrier. This would in turn prevent eczema and potentially prevent food sensitization and subsequent food allergy. So this is a trial to highlight here called the BEAT trial. They had an initial pilot study of a small group of infants. They showed a 50% reduction in atopic dermatitis at 6 months of age when regular use of standard emollients was practiced. They then went on and studied the same group in a longer trial, and those results were just presented at EAACI in 2019. Unfortunately, not the same findings. They were either parents were advised to either use a cream or a gel applied daily for the first year of life, and there was no difference in eczema between the intervention and the control groups further along at 2 years of age. So the lack of efficacy, several things. It could be about reduced adherence after 6 months of age as opposed to up to 6 months. Maybe they needed to apply the emollient more, or maybe they just needed a different, better emollient. Another trial, Prevent Add All, a relatively convoluted multi-arm trial. They looked at a skin intervention group, which was applying this kind of oil bath and a cream on the face 5 days per week up to 9 months of age. They looked at a food intervention group, introducing peanut, milk, wheat, and egg between 3 and 6 months. They looked at an arm where the kids did both, and they had a control group. We have data for the atopic dermatitis outcome. They're also looking at a food allergy outcome as well. The results for the atopic derm outcome were kind of funky. So the atopic dermatitis was highest in the infants who either received the skin intervention or the food intervention alone. It was lowest in the group that did both. But in the groups that did the single interventions, they had more atopic derm than even the control group. So, yeah, I don't know. Those are. I think the authors of this study were very disappointed in those findings, but at least possibly doing both could help. The food allergy data on this is not available yet. They're still working on that part. So, and then the Pebbles Trial is another group. They were looking at high-risk infants. There was an initial pilot study of 80 infants that they reported using Episerum twice daily for the first 6 months of age. They were looking at atopic derm and food allergy outcomes, and they were using food challenges. In their per-protocol analysis, there was definitely a significant reduction in food sensitization at 12 months in the treatment group, but those results are not fully available yet. The trial is still going on now. So ongoing trials with skin barrier enhancement. There are a few here that are notable: the STOP AD trial, the PACI trial, and the SEAL trial. Various trial designs looking at either moisturizers regularly or using various topical corticosteroids, or a combination of a topical steroid, fluticasone, and Episerum in the SEAL trial. All of them are looking at food allergy outcomes at sometime within the first couple of months. So those are all ongoing right now, results to be determined.
They really use betamethasone in kids?
Yeah, well, they're trying to, yeah.
Okay.
So these are all working
Japanese
on the
people.
assumption that that these kids are being sensitized through the skin, not oral. Right?
Yeah, these are kids who are at risk, but they don't necessarily have allergy or eczema yet. And by doing this, can they prevent any of this from happening? Both eczema and food allergy, yeah. That's the premise of this.
Anybody else irritated by all the names people make up for these studies? There's no help for me.
We're gonna retire soon.
Just trying to
It's
be,
okay.
just trying to be clever.
I don't know. I don't have a comment. I don't think it's going to change. Sorry, Len. Just a quick comment on food diversity. This is some data that was, I think, compelling. The concept is that food diversity during infancy may prevent food allergies because you expose the GI microbiome to a diverse range of foods and nutrients. So as you see here in the graph, sorry for the small print, but in the first graph, x-axis is the number of foods that are introduced into the diet at 6 months of age. On the y-axis is the probability of a food allergy occurring in the first 10 years. So you can see that there's an inverse correlation. And on this side, on the far right, is over the first 12 months of life. In both graphs, you see there's an inverse correlation for the most part in terms of the more foods you're introduced to in the first year of life is associated with a decrease in the chance of food allergies later on in childhood. So this, oops, sorry. Yeah, it reinforces the idea that just be varied, be diverse, and do it early on if you can. The AAP report, just very quickly, this was what I was talking about before, updated from the 2008 report. They talk about maternal diet in this, breastfeeding, hydrolyzed formulas, and the timing of introduction of foods. They don't talk about probiotics, vitamin D, or omega-3 fatty acids. The breastfeeding comments in the report, exclusive breastfeeding for the first 3 to 4 months decreases cumulative incidence of eczema in the first 2 years. There's no advantages to breastfeeding beyond 4 months for prevention of atopic disease. In terms of wheezing and asthma, any breastfeeding beyond 3 to 4 months might protect against wheezing in the first 2 years, and possibly against asthma even past age 5. There are no specific conclusions on breastfeeding and its impact specifically on food allergies, at least not yet. Again, no evidence that maternal dietary restriction is helpful. Lack of evidence that hydrolyzed formula prevents atopic disease. If any of you are familiar with the 2008 report, that's actually a big change. They did comment that hydrolyzed formulas could be preventative, but they come out and say that's not the case anymore. And of course, the early introduction of peanut and egg are favored. A couple of other ideas here. Or future studies that are going on. Activate, sorry, Len, more of these clever terms. They don't stop. This is looking at the microbiome. This is an interesting. So C-section infants, they get bathed in mom's vaginal microbiome right after they're born, and they'll look at food sensitization later on. Pregnut, looking at pregnancy diet, asking moms to eat more egg and peanut while they're pregnant, and looking at their children at a year of age to see if they have more or less allergy. And then vitality, vitamin D in infants, and effect on food allergy. So this is that diagram again. This is kind of our working understanding of the of what we know about food allergy. On the left side here, the allergy promoting side where you get exposed through the skin, low vitamin D, restricted microbiome. On the right side, tolerance comes from oral exposure, sufficient vitamin D, oral exposure, and then a diverse microbiome, and a lot more that we need to learn here. So conclusions, increasing number of trials to determine effective food allergy prevention strategies. It's definitely on the minds of a lot of groups now. Tolerance induction through oral exposure. We see the data for peanut and egg. The data on other foods is lacking at this moment. Other strategies, no evidence that breastfeeding has any impact on food allergy, no evidence that maternal diet changes help, no evidence that hydrolyzed or hypoallergenic formulas help. Not enough data on emollients, probiotics, vitamin D, omega-3, but those studies are underway. And we need to understand whether we screen, how we screen, what's most effective and cost effective as well. That's your word of the day again.
Food.
All right, thank you.
Pregnant.
Hey.
I'm surprised
surprised you didn't cover it, it doesn't exist after the LEAP study, that no one mimicked that with tree nuts. Is there data on tree nuts, or people just assume tree nuts act the same as peanuts?
No, there's really, I don't think there's an assumption about it. It's just, peanut is just, it's an attractive one to pour your energy into, just because of the, we talked about, it's common, it's the most common cause of fatalities. Yeah, I mean, there are the companies that are looking into the desensitization, treatments. I mean, they're all interested in tree nut in terms of formulating treatments for it. But in terms of the prevention strategies behind it, no, you're right. There hasn't been a ton yet.
Yeah, I mean, I
one thing
think
at a
it's,
time.
as I alluded to, I think it's an important question because, again, it's an allergy that hardly ever goes away.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
do you
And-
assume
and
that
I
the same
do.
strategy
Yeah, I
applies?
probably have 30 or so kids I've done cashew butter with or walnut butter, and extrapolating, and it seemed, who knows,
I mean,
right?
why would the immune system see one nut protein different than another? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, you look at the
Yeah.
EAT study, right? There was clearly a difference. Even if you
Yeah.
take it down to the per protocol analysis, there were no tree nuts in that study, but there were
Yeah.
milk, wheat. There was no difference there, and that there could be a food-specific effect that we just don't understand yet. But I think by and large I am, and it sounds like you are too. We're just treating all these foods as one and the same. I mean, there is the data on diversity, right? So exposed to as much as you can could be beneficial as well for the same or different reasons.
I sort of have two questions. One, you didn't comment, is there any new data on your food desensitization through Benaroyal, number one? Number two, has anybody tried to make a house that's totally peanut-free, egg-free, wheat-free, and then see if those kids come up with a different answer?
So the second question, I'm not aware of any data, but I don't know anybody who'd want to do that. That's tough. Those are big foods that would be, I mean, it would be like restricting them from the entire family. So I'm not sure how many takers there would be on that. As far as desensitization, yeah, I didn't talk about that at all. I think Dan talked about that recently, and so I didn't want to encroach onto his territory. And I read his slides. I think that I would support everything he said. You guys probably know just as well as I do. Probably will hear stuff about Immune this year, probably the first half of this year, and then DBV. It's not clear. Maybe early next year sometime.
I know Immune just hired their sales force, and they're expecting approval any day.
Yeah, I think they're proposing first quarter, but I don't know how quick the FDA will. They've been going super fast so far, so I'm not sure.
David, earlier you showed studies that they excluded kids who had a greater than 5 millimeter wheal on skin testing.
The LEAP study?
Yeah. And then you also showed data that if two parents were allergic, there was a 60-80% that children might have some allergy.
Yeah.
Did they do anything about excluding kids who had parents that were both allergic in any of these studies, or did they just take all comers? I mean, wouldn't that be a risk factor?
So that's on all atopy, the
Yeah,
two-parent
right.
thing, and it's not clear yet in terms of how much that actually specifically impacts food allergy. So no, they weren't selecting those out or including those more in these studies, not that I'm aware of. Yeah. It was really more about what was going on in the actual infant, him or herself. Yeah.
Does yogurt have the same allergens as regular milk?
Yeah, for the most part,
Sure.
yeah. Actually, a lot. I think
Yeah.
I like yogurt in many ways.
Yeah.
It's actually much
Well, the
more.
good news is you get the lactobacillus too.
Yeah, you get that too. Can't harm you.
That's what's really helpful.
You can stir in some peanut flour and some egg flour into your yogurt, right? Just get it to take everything.
Right.
What do you tell your patients? They come in and ask you, what should I do to protect my children?
Yeah, I'm actually
Yeah.
Get them out of here.
so for probably about 6 months or so, I've really actually have been attempting to not screen anybody for peanut, even if they have an egg allergy, kind of like the Australian guidelines. And I select very carefully parents who I feel would be very capable of monitoring and doing it well, and that they have a steady head on their shoulders and not super anxious. And I'm actually doing okay with that right now. But generally speaking, other than that, I'm, no rules, as much as you can, as early as you can, as long as they're developmentally ready. I am not recommending any kind of restriction.
It sounds like you're sort of recommending the opposite. So, I mean, is it to the point where you should say you should give your kids these foods as much as you can right now? You don't test them, you don't do anything, they don't have any symptoms. Is it better to say you should give all your kids peanuts and eggs and milk right when they're born? I mean, is it?
No, not right when they're born. When they're ready to start solid foods.
So you wouldn't put it in their formula or anything?
No, not. I mean, who knows? That might be something that is. There's no data on that early. And right now we still have to answer the question about breastfeeding and formula too. I mean, if we can't do that in breastfeeding or in breast milk, so if we strip away breast milk to do that, is that going to help or harm? That also remains to be seen as well.
These arguments have been going on for about 35 years.
Yeah, maybe longer. All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it's interesting, it strikes me it's a little like saving your old clothes. They'll come back in fashion.
Oh, absolutely.
These strategies will come back in fashion.
There you go, Mike, so we're not too old yet to save our stuff. We're never in fashion.